Good evening, Tac-Con. My name is Tiffany, and I am back to introduce to you Mr. Ed Monk of Last Resort Firearms Training. Ed, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Tiffany. Always good to talk to you.
Always good to talk to you. And I am so thrilled at the little sign that's over your shoulder. So, for anybody who didn't notice the sign, yes, Ed made a sign and it has made my day. So, that's why I'm beaming. So, thank you, Ed. Um, but we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about you. So, for those who haven't met you yet, please introduce yourself to the TACCon family.
Sure. My name is Ed Monk. I'm a retired Army officer, a former deputy sheriff in Kentucky. I'm currently a part-time police officer here in Arkansas. I'm a range master, certified instructor at the master level. I live here in Arkansas, and with my brother, I co-own and operate Last Resort Firearms Training, which is a gun training facility about 30 miles south of Little Rock. Over the past 10 years, one of the things we kind of specialized in is training to counter the active shooter, to educate the public on understanding the active shooter so they better understand the threat and therefore can better prepare for it, and also to counter the active shooter, which individually, kinetically, tactically, but also for people making plans, such as businesses, organizations can make plans to limit the damage should an active shooter show up. I've trained law enforcement, including resource officers, armed school staff, because here in Arkansas, our staff at schools can be armed church security teams, and just citizens at large. I've been studying this threat of the active shooter pretty intensely over about the last 12 years. We offer 1, 2, and 3-day classes on countering the active shooter. When this year, we've started offering a 2-day active shooter instructor class that's going really well. And I've done presentations like I'm going to do at Tac-Con in 2021. I've done them at past Tac-Cons, the Alert Conference, giving it to law enforcement agencies, churches, universities, businesses, government agencies, and other audiences. So I'll be happy to do it again at Tac-Con.
And we are excited. And for anybody who's been to Ed's active shooter presentation, it's never the same thing twice. He always updates the data to the very, very most recent information. And I must say, this presentation, Ed, just took everybody by storm. I think people had maybe something kind of generic in mind when they thought about an active shooter presentation, and they were expecting the same kind of bromides. But you really, really just drum down on all of the fine details, and you dispel a lot of myths, and you use really hard empirical data to make your points. And so I would love for you to tell everybody about your active shooter threat and response class. It's a 4-hour classroom block, and you are starting us off out of the gate first thing Friday morning at 8 a.m. And there is a very intriguing acronym, GTFIT. You're going to tell us what that means, right?
Well, for polite audiences, it's get the fudge in there. For non-polite audiences, it's slightly different. I mean, just math. What keeps the victim count the lowest is somebody getting in there and stopping the guy. So whether you're an armed citizen or I talk to a lot of cops, including resource officers. This is not, once he starts shooting, it's not going to stop until somebody goes and stops it. So the quicker you get in there and stop it, the lower the victim count will be. It's a very easy, low-level math that even a guy like I can do. So my presentation, if you've seen it before, it's going to look very similar, but it will be updated. It'll cover more than 20, a focus and a study on more than 20 different active shooter attacks, try to show a variety, and not only show them, but then glean what lessons can we learn out of this, what pattern analysis and what trends to help us focus for the future. Ones I've covered in the past we'll recover, but there's more information that's come out, such as on Parkland and Pulse nightclub because of lawsuits. There's a lot more information, and it's not good. Parkland is just unbelievably ugly on not only the sheriff's office response, but the school's response. And I'll have more videos as well. So the goal here is to help people understand the threat, because it's different than what I think most people with guns train for, which is the parking lot mugger. This is a totally different threat, so we need to understand it to, dear William April would say, to make a parking space in our mind so that we understand this threat we're up against. Who are they? What kind of weapons will they have? Where will they start the attack? And that's different if they're in a middle school or a college or a church or a business. Where they will start is different based on the statistics. So we want to better prepare ourselves. That includes mental preparation, tactics, skills, and our gear to go up against this threat. And we'll focus in on a few other topics. We'll show just simply, not emotionally, but mathematically, that armed citizens being present when these attacks starts is by far gives us the best results, which is a low victim count. We'll look at political arguments against having armed citizens for this threat, and it's pretty easy to show that those arguments hold no water. We'll focus in and look specifically on school issues with the active shooter because they all too often happen at schools. And we'll look at political arguments about it again, but that's basically the 4 hours.
There's a lot jam-packed in there, and I'm guessing based on what you're saying that a lot has changed in terms of best practices tactically since Columbine. But I suspect you'll go into a lot of detail about all the mistakes made there and at other incidents. And so that is Ed's active shooter presentation, 4 hours Friday morning, starting at 8 a.m. in classroom 1. But wait, there's more. Guys, if you want even more from Ed,
there's always more.
There's always more. He is bringing
There's always more.
The first time. This is some relatively new content, if I'm not mistaken, Ed, that you've developed recently in response to recent events, your riot and protest survival material. And I know you have a much longer block that you do with Last Resort, but you're bringing us a 2-hour version of it. Tell us about that one.
Well, this is new, and it's not something that I consider myself an expert in at all, but we developed this recently because of the recent problems with violent protest here in America. So we see this as a third threat. You know, what we've taught in the past is always the most likely against the mugger in the parking lot, then the active shooter threat. But now here, this violent protest, this is a separate, different threat. So we designed this class, which this presentation is a part of, because we kept, since the riots and protests have started, we kept getting so many questions from our students in other classes about, well, how should we handle this? What are our options? What should we do? What are the legal ramifications? And unfortunately, we kept getting some crazy comments from students about, oh, this is what I'm going to do. And we'd say, well, that's an option, but it's an option that'll probably ruin your life. So we developed this to give people, again, get them prepared mentally, skill-wise. Now, the class won't really let you apply the skills, but we'll talk about them in the presentation. And the overall goal is to keep you out of jail, out of the courtroom, out of the hospital, and out of the poorhouse. That's kind of the goals of this information. Again, this threat is very different than the mugger or the active killer or active shooter. The number of people that you're potentially up against is much greater just by definition of it being a protest or a riot. And you might not be fighting them all, but a good portion of them will probably be witnesses against you should you have to fight any of them. And if you fight one of them, the chances of some of the others joining in is great. So the numbers you're up against, the goal of that person you're up against is completely different. The weapons they'll have, much more broad and different. I think you're going to have a much more complex legal problem should you be forced to or choose to fight any of these people in a violent protest. And that's because of the political aspects of it, and also because of the fear that a prosecutor might have that if they don't charge, the mob could turn on them. So they'll charge you now it's up to the jury. It's not their fault. They didn't do anything. When we think the tactical problem of fighting in one of these violent protests or riots is also much more complex. And the bottom line that I try to push home is this: if you offer any resistance, to include verbal, light physical, less than lethal, any resistance at all in one of these violent protests, the chances of it very rapidly escalating to deadly force is almost guaranteed. So before you do anything, you'd better be prepared to go to deadly force. Therefore, before you do anything, it should be the absolute last resort, because you have two ugly problems looking at you: the physical fight in which you could get hurt or killed, and then the legal fight, which almost guaranteed you're going to have, because again, the legal scrutiny you're going to get, even if you do everything right, is something that we don't want anybody to have. So This is the kind of stuff we'll talk about. We'll look at 3 or 4 videos and analyze about 3 or 4 of these protest attacks that happened, some of which most people have seen, maybe 1 or 2 they haven't. And again, we think those 4 show a pretty good variety that we can look at and war game and break down and say, okay, what are our options? What is the least worst of those options? So again, William April, make the parking lot in your brains and think this through when you're not emotional and not under stress and you've got somewhere to go should it happen. And kind of one little special thing we'll focus in on is what to do if you're in your car and get caught trapped in your car during one of these protests. And we'll talk about that, and I'll give my recommendations on kind of rules of engagements and triggers, but then I invite everybody, you got to make your own, because I'm probably not going to be sitting in the courtroom with you, and I'm probably not going to be sitting in jail with you.
Right. Well, if you're lucky enough to have Ed Monk in the car with you, if the flag flies, then hey, that's probably a best case scenario under really bad circumstances. But unfortunately, most of us are not that lucky. So we will have to attend your session. I have 1,000 questions for you, Ed, just from that brief introduction, but I'm not going to spoil it. Instead, I will tell everybody, go to Ed's class. He is a phenomenal trainer, phenomenal speaker, and everything he says is backed up by hard evidence and empirical study. So that's one of my favorite things about Ed. You don't just get up there and pontificate. You've got the research to back it up. So I encourage everybody. This second session from Ed is on Saturday afternoon from 1 to 2:45 in classroom 2. And I am so glad that you're presenting twice this year, Ed. I'm really looking forward to seeing you in Dallas. Be safe until then, and I will see you very soon, my friend.
Thank you, Tiffany. See you in March, if not before.